Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's 6:30. I'd like to call to order the special council meeting for tonight. We acknowledge with respect that we're meeting on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen speaking people, and we're honored to have this opportunity to build strong working relationships with the people of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. May I have a motion and a seconder to approve tonight's agenda? Mr. Grove and Councillor Jordison. All in favor? Unanimous. We don't have anyone registered to speak at public participation virtually, and seeing no members of public here tonight, we will jump over public participation. We'll get right on to new business. Just to let everyone know that the budget items not discussed during tonight's special meeting will be brought forward as unfinished business at our meeting on February 23rd. That's this Thursday. And I'll turn it over to Ms. Hepting, Director of Finance. Go ahead, Jen.
Thank you, Mayor Kobayashi. With that, I will just pause one moment for my presentation to be displayed. And you're correct. So tonight is the first of a series of budget meetings this week. Whatever we don't finish tonight, we will simply continue on under this agenda when we reconvene Thursday evening at 6:30. So start a bit of a brief overview in terms of our timeline. I'll suggest in terms of the scheduled time that we have for this year's budget deliberations, we're perhaps a little over the halfway mark. So we met in December, we discussed the budget approach that we would be undertaking that was endorsed by this council. We highlighted some of the financial implications, the financial challenges, if you will, that have been incorporated into this plan. Last month, we met for a series of meetings for our service review. Administration received direction on the level of service for each of our areas. The financial implications of that direction have been incorporated into this draft plan that's before you tonight. Tonight, we'll start with a bit of an overview in terms of the highlights. So where we're sitting in terms of the draft property tax increase. I'd like to spend a little bit of time discussing our funding sources. So in particular, both our current reserve balances, as well as a discussion about debt management. As you know, this financial plan does propose we utilize long-term debt financing. And so I'd like to go through the implications of that in a little more detail. We'll then move back into our service plans, specifically into the special initiatives. So those are typically the one-time spends associated with each service area. You have not yet heard information on the special initiatives proposed under this financial plan. And then moving out of that review, it really will be over to you for recommendations on any changes you wish to see within this draft financial plan. That's what's planned for this week. Series of 3 meetings. We're then back in chambers March 13th with the intention of introducing the financial plan bylaw. I recognize there is a fair bit of content for us to cover. Please, at any time, if we wish to take a recess, by all means, let me know. As well, in terms of questions, there's no need to wait. With every slide, every topic, I will take pause, and our preference is to answer questions as we go. So service review did conclude the direction we received was to maintain existing service delivery in all areas with the exception of 2. The area of policing, council did resolve to increase policing services, specifically with the addition of 1 RCMP officer. This draft financial plan has included an additional officer in each year under the plan. As you know, we will be reviewing what that desired target level is. And so future years may change depending on that direction. Council resolved to decrease the service level within the area of public works specific to the termination of the Colwood cleanup event. So the financial implications associated with that event have been adjusted from this draft financial plan. With that, I'll pause. Any questions on the integration of recent direction received? So the 2023,
Sorry, Jen, Councillor Day.
Sorry, I should have spoken up quicker. I'm just wondering, with our service levels and how we've determined that they be maintained at what is proposed, we did receive an offer for a volunteer association to do some of the events that normally are done by staff. I'm just wondering, is that something that you need specific direction on, or is that something that can come at a later date?
thank you through the chair. Thank you for that question. Yes, I would seek specific direction on that. And I would suggest that the best time to bring that up will be when we get back into that specific service area, which I don't anticipate will be tonight, but likely Thursday evening.
Okay.
So when we do revisit each of the service areas, we will pause at each and ask of council if there are any recommended changes specific to each.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So the 2023 budget, in sum, under legislation, we are required to balance. We cannot budget for a surplus or deficit. We are looking at a $54 million budget. So we've got just over $25 million in operating expenses. We have about $2 million in one-time special initiative operating expenses. Our capital budget for 2023 is just shy of $20 million. In addition, we're funding transfers to our reserves of just over $6.5 million, and we have some debt repayment. So in 10 seconds, that's the 23 budget. The intention tonight is that we'll focus on the capital aspect. We spent last month reviewing the operating budget, and by the end of this week, this council will have been walked through the entirety of this 5-year financial plan. We initiated service review, reviewing the draft property tax increase for 2023. As a result of the direction received during service review, this slide here summarizes where we currently sit. So 3 primary factors to consider. We're looking at a 3.7% increase to maintain existing and previously approved increased services. We're looking at a further 2.9% to support increased policing, along with increased transfers to reserves for our West Shore detachment facility, which we'll talk about in more depth during our debt management review. And then lastly, the 1% transfer to sustainable infrastructure. So these 3 drivers we will be referring to throughout. In particular, the 3.7% for city services. And as we review each of our service areas, we'll reaffirm if there's any changes that we wish to make to our service areas to affect that 3.7%. The 2.9% conversation and direction will be specific within the area of policing. And then lastly, the 1% for our sustainable infrastructure reserve. Reference some context during service review with respect to the impact that this proposed increase would have on a representative property. So 1% is about $20. The 7.58% overall increase is about $165. And I will pause. I did see Mayor Kobayashi.
Thank you very much. Just a quickie here. I noticed the city services slipped up. It was at 3.6 and it's now 3.7. And is there one thing that made it jump up a little bit? Every little bit counts. So that's my question.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. So the service review opened with the preliminary tax increase of about 0.1% lower than where it currently is. The primary driver for that difference was a review of our fuel budgets, which I will highlight in a couple of slides from now. So we did increase our fuel budgets. Conversely, we did drop the operating budget associated with the cleanup event. That primarily explains that difference moving from the 3.6, which was communicated last month, to the 3.7%.
Thank you.
And so I do want to take a moment to highlight, and I'm now on page 17 of the draft financial plan, and I'm not certain how easy it is to navigate through your agenda notes, but we have provided a breakdown to understand the core operating budget increase, as well as previously approved increased services. And so we're looking at requiring an additional $1.2 million generated by property taxation to support our existing service delivery. And we'll walk through some of those cost drivers that we have touched on previously. In addition, under previous financial plans and previous service review, there were certain areas where council had endorsed increased levels of service. I'll just take pause in one moment. Fire paid on call transition was initiated in 2022, and we will continue to see the financial implications of that transition into 2024. Enhanced emergency support services, specific with the introduction of an emergency program coordinator. So that was previously approved for 2023. Enhanced asset management support, both in the area of GIS and in the area of finance. That is proposed for 2023 and into 2024. In the area of heritage, under last year's financial plan and the 2022 service review, there was discussions surrounding the heritage strategy, which is in progress, and coming out of that related is the introduction of a heritage grant budget. We then have the operating impacts of new capital. So the 2023 budget sees, to note, a heavy duty mechanic position to support our growing fleet and some of our aging fleet. Those increases are then offset by some increased fees that are being generated and also by new construction taxation. Our financial plan anticipates new construction taxation. Our financial plan allocates that taxation based on growth needs. And so this financial plan sees about 85% of that new tax supporting operations and the remaining 15% supporting increased transfers to reserves. And so with that, before I get into some of the cost drivers for our core budget, see Councillor Day.
Thank you. I just want to let everybody know how to use your agenda notes. So if you have the financial plan open, and you'll have a set of tools on the right-hand side. The one that says the number, it's the lowest thing. When you touch that button, you can punch in the page number that you want to go to at the top. So it'll be go to page number, fill in the blank of 144, and then you just hit go and it will take you there. Just a bit of help for those who may not know how to do that.
Thank you very much, Councillor Day.
And so returning to page 17, when we look at the cost drivers that are contributing to our core budget increase, labor is the largest contributor. We're looking at overall an increase in our labor budget of about 6.8%. And so it was mentioned during service review, our contractual increase in labor is approximately 6%. And then in some service areas, we have had financial implications associated with restructures, and that accounts for the difference. When we look at our contracted services, we're seeing an increase of about 5% to our contracted services. The majority of that increase is for factors outside of our control. The bottom chart on the screen here outlines the primary budgets within our contracted services. So the RCMP contract right there, that's for the existing. This is before the additional increase of the one officer. But just to support the existing contract, that budget alone is an increase of about $220,000. West Shore Parks and Rec, you heard from those folks last week with respect to their increased budget requisition. Greater Victoria Public Library, we will have their representatives in chambers later this week to discuss their requisition budget. As well as our insurance premiums, we're seeing a bit of an increase there. Factors within the city's control when you look at all remaining contracted services budgets. And so this is everything from professional services contracts, repair and maintenance contracts. We have more or less maintained a static budget. The increase overall is less than 1%. And when we look at our supplies budget and our software maintenance and licensing budgets, we've actually decreased those budgets ever so slightly. And so I did want to highlight that and preface these discussions with, we have not simply applied inflationary factors throughout this financial plan. We really have reviewed and we've had to do some internal reallocation to support where there are cost drivers, in the area of fuel. We looked at what existing budgets we could reallocate to an extent. And so it's important to consider some of the factors that are driving just supporting existing service delivery. With that, I'll pause.
Yep, Councillor Day.
Yeah, just a quick question. So for example, we're looking at the line for fuel there and 18.2% change that represents. I'm just wondering how that fits with your other diagram we were just looking at for kind of how all of these build up to the tax increase that we're looking at for this year of 7.58% overall. So I'm just wondering the 18.2%. So we're not just adding up these percentages, we're plugging them into a bigger formula.
So perhaps just thank you for that question. So to take a step back, the first chart that we reviewed provided a breakdown of the overall increase. And so the next charts that follow are really speaking to that very first line. So overall, we're looking at, call it a 3.7% increase to support existing and previously approved service delivery. That's $670,000.
So 18% of that 670 is the cost for fuels have increased. No,
okay. But bear with me. So $670,000, that's just shy of a 3.7% increase on last year's property tax revenue. To further understand how we got to the 670,000, if we didn't have new construction taxation, well, if we didn't have the growth in the community, we likely wouldn't have the increase needed to support existing city services. But that increase to support existing city services is a little over $1.2 million. And that's when we start to look at, okay, what's driving that $1.2 million in terms of core operations by function. So not by activity, but by labor, supplies. And then we look at each of those supply budgets. So the 18%, that's just the fuel change against the fuel budget from last year.
Okay. So a concern that I have, and this seems like a good place to bring it up because we're talking about big picture thinking here, is that when I was looking through the budget today, I don't really see anything specific in the budget, no big studies, no investigations that would address geotechnical issues or sewer capacity issues, which is what we have to address in order to continue to have that development move forward that's funding so much of our budget. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around whether or not we're budgeting sufficiently to be able to provide those services in the future. Like if there's nothing in this budget to address geotechnical issues or sewer capacity issues, when are we going to address that? And, do we need to start saving now in order to do that?
Through the chair, thank you for the question. So no, there is not a direct tax lift associated with works of that nature. When we get into the sewer utility capital budget and the special initiative budget in that related area, that would be an opportunity to bring up if there is direction for staff to return with further works for consideration. In addition, my expectation is that work would likely be funded through our sewer utility. And so not as much the conversation about the increase in our general municipal taxation, but a factor to consider when we are considering the increase in our sewer utility rates.
Thank you. And with respect to that specific question, within this plan, within this calendar year, administration will be returning with the sewer master plan. A component of the sewer master plan is a consideration and distillation of the capacities that we have with the CRD. And so that will trigger a conversation about when and how Colwood will need to begin reconciling our capacity against our growing community on top of parts of Colwood that might want to connect to the sewer that aren't currently sewer. So that part of the conversation relative to CRD capacity is already kind of on the agenda for a discussion in this chambers this year as part of the sewer master plan.
Councilor Ward?
Yeah, sorry, different question. You'll have to excuse my neophyte view on it, Jen, but just looking at the consolidated budget year over year. So if I just want to make sure I'm correct here, for all your comparisons, you're using the 2022 budget as sort of the delta. You don't compare versus 2022 projected actuals. Is that right?
That's correct. In terms of the central theme of a property tax increase, that increase is a comparative to the budgeted tax levy from the year before. That budgeted tax levy is ultimately what drives the impact on our ratepayers. That's how we levy our rates is based on what we budget. And so in turn, when we want to have the conversation about understanding the tax increase, it is budget to budget. The projected actuals are incredibly important to understand how the budget is being utilized and if the budget is warranted, and in understanding, is the budget sufficient? Is it in excess? And that is why we include the projected actuals and we do speak to them within each of the service profiles. And to take it a step further within the specific service plans and the operating budgets themselves, this year, we also focused on the change between what was approved for 2023 under our current financial plan, the 22 to 26, versus what we are proposing under the updated plan, because it's also important to recognize that this is a multi-year plan and there is consideration being given to future years. And so some of these conversations, they have been happening for years now, and we have anticipated the implications. And so there's a number of pieces of information, current year projected actuals, previously approved budgets for this year, as well as the updated draft budget. And so we want to provide all of those comparatives. But you're correct, in the consolidated year over year, because of that central theme of understanding the property tax increase, that is where the delta is shown. The change is draft budget to prior year approved budget. We absolutely could provide additional information. It's always a balance, just in terms of not inundating this plan with too much.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Just a quick question, or three questions I have. The first one was, you have to switch the light switch on a few times for me to understand something, but it finally clicked here, and that's the new construction taxation. And it was an interesting comment. I didn't realize, I do now clearly understand. 85% is used for operations and 15% you said goes to reserve fund. And so is that a normal, do we have a bylaw that says we have to do it that way, or how is that set up, and how did we come up with those numbers?
Thank you. I really appreciate that question. To directly answer your question, no, we don't have a bylaw. We do have a sustainable infrastructure replacement plan that talks a lot about how we should be utilizing the increased and the new revenues that are associated with the growth and development of our city. And it is split between, the reality is there will be an increase in the operating expenses of the city to support that growth and development. And it's really important that we continue to remember, the impact of that growth and development on our existing infrastructure, and ensuring that we have sufficient funding set aside for the major maintenance and replacement of that
So that is for
infrastructure.
sure then, the 15%?
Yes,
Oh,
and
that's
so
all
in
you have
terms
to
of the
explain.
split,
Yeah.
in recent years, we've managed to put about 25% into reserves, 75% into operations. This draft budget for 23 proposes 85% for operations, 15% for reserves.
Okay, that explains it all to me. That sums it up. So my second question is, when we decided to start electrifying our fleet, everyone expects a dividend, right? And I was kind of surprised that our fuel went up, and yet we're electrifying our fleet. So it seemed to be, this is interesting. I would have at least thought it might level the playing field, because I know fuel prices have gone up, obviously. So I suspected that would happen, but there is no dividend from electrifying our fleets.
There absolutely is. So the fuel budget has gone up in the short term. If we look at the fuel budget over the span of this 5-year plan, we do anticipate that it will decrease as we further electrify our fleet. The flip of that is that as we electrify our fleet, we are going to realize an increased need to set aside additional funds into our sustainable for the replacement of electrification of the fleet versus the traditional fuel. So we're taking that funding and increasing our transfer to reserves with it. When we get into the reserves conversation, I'll speak a little bit more, but ultimately we will be back in chambers to provide further analysis and a bit more of a deep dive on our existing level of sustainable funding, as well as where we would like to get to.
Two more questions. So next question had to do with I always get worried when this was a game in private industry, the miscellaneous or other expenses. And in this case, we have other contracted services, and that's 26% of our total contracted services. So is it just all thousands of small projects, and therefore you're not listing them all, or because it is like 26% of all contracted services?
No, thank you for the question. I mean, we can certainly return with further information. When you look at the contracted services budgets by each service area, in the area of public works related areas, it's a fair bit of repair and maintenance budgets. Utility budgets are included within there. In the areas of finance and engineering, for example, it's professional services. So audit budgets, it's legal budgets for corporate administration.
Okay, fair enough. I don't know if I have to be that granular, that's for sure, but as long as I understood what it was. And just the last question, and maybe Mr. Earl, you can help me with this one, because all of us, obviously none of us know what this is, but I always had a theory, in private business, when you own a bunch of businesses, you always reach this point, this inflection point, right? Where you sort of say, we're not going to grow anymore because the cost of it, we have a negative return on it, basically, because as you try to grow more, you're adding more services. Therefore, in business, you're seeing less profit. So this isn't a for-profit organization, but I guess what I'm trying to, the question I really have is, when you're looking at new construction taxation, are we in the ballpark that, we're doing about almost $1 million a year? I think we were about $1 million last year, another $1 million, compared to how we're spending with our budget. Are we in line basically, or are we offside? I don't know. I don't know where the good benchmark is right now. So I wonder if you could answer that question.
Sorry, Your Worship, just so I can understand the question, is the question of the million, how is the split of spend?
No, it's actually as a percentage of the cost to existing city services right now. Like our existing services are 1.2, 1.9, right, million. And right now we're collecting in new construction taxes almost $1 million. So it's almost a 1-to-1. Is that sort of normal, or are we better than most? Are we worse than most? It's that benchmark number I'm looking at right now. Are we doing everything we can? Should we be going? Is this telling me we should go after more commercial right now to increase the revenues? I guess that's the question. What is that number, or do you know? Is it an unknown?
I mean, there's a lot of different moving parts to that question.
Okay.
I think communities can be quite successful with zero growth. And many communities do it quite well. I think other communities have found success through growth. And so I don't think there's one answer to that question. In terms of the split of how much of that new growth should be set aside for recapitalization versus spent on operating costs, in my experience, 75-25 is a good target. And it's really relative to the value of your infrastructure compared to the size of your operating budget.
Okay.
And also understanding with respect to that infrastructure, the average useful life and how quick you're going to have to recapitalize it. But from my perspective, municipalities that I've seen that do it well are setting aside at least 25 cents of every dollar to recapitalize their existing infrastructure. And that would kind of assume a municipality has an average amount of infrastructure. Does that answer?
Yeah, it does. It's a general, yes. Good enough. That's all I have. Any other questions? Let's proceed, Jen.
We spoke briefly during orientation, budget principles to keep in mind as we continue through this review. So when we look at our recurring spend, so our operating budgets to support existing services, new services, as well as our operating budgets to support our infrastructure, our capital, we need to ensure that we have continued revenues, that we have sustainable revenues. So taxation, user fees, and operating grants, those are the primary revenue types. Taxation for the city is by and far our largest operating revenue. And then when we, when we review the capital and the special initiative spend, those are typically one-time spends. So our capital program, this capital program before you, is financed in part long-term debt proceeds, which we'll speak about, surplus and reserves, and then as well capital grants. This plan integrates both capital grants that we have been awarded as well as those that are pending application. And we'll highlight, but some of those that are pending, if we are unsuccessful, we have no intention of moving forward. I highlight this, to keep in mind, perhaps as we continue through these conversations and you're keeping in mind that 3.7% increase, whether it's deferral of a special initiative or consideration of halting capital spend, that will not have a direct impact on that annual property tax increase. So reserve funds. Page 110 of the draft financial plan provides a summary of, in essence, our funding sources. This year, we will be back in chambers to review kind of the history, the purpose, as well as the intended plan for each of our reserve funds. Right now, the city has 3 reserve fund bylaws. We have 18 reserve funds. This chart before you We've added a legend to our plan this year, just to provide a little bit of background in terms of how we are funding our reserves. So when we look at the budgeted activity, we're looking to set aside a little over $6.7 million into our reserves. A little over $3.5 million of that is funded through property taxation. So we are well on our way in terms of increasing that annual transfer to our sustainable infrastructure reserve. The funding source for that is general taxation. But in addition, it's important to recognize our community amenities reserve, our affordable housing reserve, our fire hall reserve fund, as well as DCC charges. Those are all generated through development in the city and through the development community. And so these funds here, in addition to grant applications, those form the basis for our pots of money, if you will, that we utilize to fund our capital spend and our special initiative spend. When we talk about whether or not we're sustainably funded, there's about 6 reserves before you. So the equipment replacement reserve fund, our fleet related reserve funds, our police building, and then as well as our sustainable infrastructure. Those are what we consider in sum as being the funding to sustain our existing infrastructure. And when we look at what we're setting aside to those funds in 2023, it's about $3.5 million. That's what we're budgeting to set aside. What should we be setting aside? Well, under our existing plan, it's a little under $5 million. So under our existing plan, we're about 70% of the way there. So when that plan was first presented to council, we anticipated it would take us about 12 years to close that gap until we were sustainably funded. And we're almost at the halfway mark. That being said, we know that that plan is in need of an update. That update is in very early stages. It has been initiated, but it is in early stages. And I anticipate we will be continuing those conversations throughout this year. But that in part is to understand where our tax dollars are going. It's also to support our reserves, which we utilize for our capital spend. And then when we look at where we project these funds to be, both at the end of 2023 and then at the end of this 5-year plan, overall, we are projecting a $10 million increase. Now, what does that mean? Well, that's in part related to the continued increase of what we're setting aside for sustainability, but also the effects of where we're projecting development will drive the balances of our development funded reserves. We'll pause for one question, but I did want to highlight the road DCC's projected balance received a fair bit of attention during 2022, as we were monitoring spend on approved road DCC's projects. Based on the cash that was collected, we do not expect we will need to do any internal borrowing against other DCCs to support the existing road DCC projects. And so I did want to highlight that for the road DCC projects that are underway, we do have sufficient cash. We'll talk a little bit about some of the sidewalk and bike lane related projects that we will seek long-term financing for. But I did want to highlight that because that is a shift from where we thought we were at Q2 of 22. And we'll pause for Councillor Ward.
Yes, Councillor Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Sorry, Jen. Actually, I wanted to ask about DCCs. I noticed the parklands listed as cash in lieu. Is there no DCC on parks at this present time? I understand maybe that was a discussion that had started but isn't complete, or?
Correct. So we are looking to implement a parks DCC bylaw, and we expect to have that back for consideration in 2023.
Okay, thank you.
Seeing no other questions, please proceed.
One of our sources of funds is that of our surplus. So as you know, we do not budget for a surplus. The reality is the majority of the time, and certainly consistently as far as I can remember, we do generate an operating surplus. 2022, our preliminary estimation is that we will generate an operating surplus of about $250,000. Last year, we generated an operating surplus of about $750,000. The impact of the pandemic on financial, how we actualized financially, both in 2020 and 21. I mean, consulting budgets, training and professional development budgets, staffing vacancies, I would say were absolutely somewhat heightened in terms of the surplus that we drove. The 2020 operating surplus was upwards over $1 million. We can provide further information going back in time. I really wanted to just highlight that the operating reality is we are likely to generate surpluses just in general operations. You've heard us comment before, it's the conservative nature of municipal financial planning practices. It's the legislative requirement that we cannot budget for a deficit or a surplus. And so we do have balanced budgets in place. And the reality of that there typically are transitions, and those transitions will lead to time delays with hiring and that sort of thing. That said, those surpluses do become a funding source. And if you look back, when we look at that first line there, the general operating surplus, we're proposing to spend almost the entirety of that balance on infrastructure projects within this plan. And so if there's no further questions there, we'll move into a bit of a conversation about debt management. Currently, we have approximately $8 million outstanding, both in long-term debt and in equipment financing loans. As you can see, the majority of our long-term debt that's outstanding relates to that of our sewer infrastructure. And that debt is serviced through a local area parcel tax within the benefiting properties in that area. The debt that was previously issued for the Q Center facility will mature next year. The debt that was previously issued for Triangle Mountain Drainage will mature next year.
Just could you just go back on the previous slide? I just want to make sure I'm clear. In the sewer, Code East, Code Central, is part of that for the sewage treatment plant then? Where's
No.
that shown?
Great question. So both the debt servicing and the operating costs associated with the region's wastewater treatment plant are within the CRD's requisition, which really the sewer utility service plan and operating budget provides a little bit of background as to how we're currently funding those
I do
charges.
understand. Thank you very much.
And so there are legislative requirements that we must consider when we are considering whether or not to take on new debt. And so legislatively, there's a liability servicing limit. And what this is it's a calculation, and it basically looks at our recurring revenues, and those revenues that are really within our control. So property taxation, some of our user fees. And we are allowed to borrow debt that requires an annual repayment up to 25% of our recurring revenues. So this legislation is in place from a cash flow perspective, but also somewhat of an affordability perspective. And so when we consider, you look at the first line there, 2023, the existing debt we have outstanding, that annual payments just shy of $1 million, which represents about 14% of our liability servicing limit. This information is important to consider because that we have a fair bit of room in terms of the allowable debt that this municipality is allowed to take on under legislation. With any debt that we take on, we need to consider how we're going to finance that debt. So it may be financed through general taxation, it may be financed through our sewer utility, or we may seek, a new revenue stream to support that debt servicing. So right now, general taxation supports the debt associated with our drainage, our fire fleet, and our facility, and then it's the sewer utility parcel taxation.
I still didn't understand that math. Sorry, can you just go back? Because it says it cannot exceed 25% of its controllable sustainable revenues, right? So 25% of what then? What is controllable sustainable revenues?
Absolutely, great question. So when we look at our recurring revenues for 2023,
Yes.
those are approximately $26 million. So 25% of that amount is a little over $6.5 million. So this legislation requires that the total debt we have outstanding, the annual repayment cannot exceed $6.5 million.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
What's even more important to recognize is that any change in debt, we need to fund that servicing. Even if we have existing revenues, we don't currently have those revenues allocated to service any new debt. So we need to consider.
Clearly understand that. Thank you.
My advice is new debt, we need the new revenues. So this financial plan proposes new debt in 3 areas. So firstly, our sidewalk and bike lane program. And I use the word propose. We'll speak in a moment about the difference between the short-term and the long-term financing. Long-term financing ultimately requires our community's approval. So we have endorsement from council on our sidewalk and bike lane projects that we'll get into later this evening. Council has directed us to prepare and return with the loan authorization bylaws on these works. And then we will, continue through that public process. But in terms of the estimated cost of these works and moving forward on these works, we have design work well underway. We have moved on 2 initial projects that aren't subject to the debt financing, and we have a number of remaining projects that we will be seeking the public's approval on this year. And so for the sidewalk and bike lane related projects, there's a new debt just shy of $8.5 million associated with 5 infrastructure projects. Going through the public process this year, pending public approval, we are anticipating an issue in 2024. These numbers that are before you in terms of an annual repayment amount of just shy of $500,000, that assumes that we will seek a 30-year borrow term. That term is being suggested. It's the highest term under the MFA. It's the closest in terms of the estimated useful life of these works. And the current rate right now, lending rate for the next 10-year period is about 3.8%. It's important to remember the MFA, not only do they have, they've got great lending rates, but then our funds are set aside. They do generate some earnings. And so when we consider those actuarial adjustments, this debt is effectively a rate of about 2.2%. From a financial planning perspective, we budget based on the 2.2%. We don't budget based on the indicative rate. The next consideration for new debt under this financial plan is the financing associated with the proposed Public Works Administration building. So just to backcast a little, in May of 2022, council endorsed a master planning exercise that really is used to support the conversations that have happened regarding this proposed facility since that time. In September of 2022, we were back before council with some preliminary Class D cost estimates associated with varying sized facilities for consideration. Ultimately, council deferred that consideration to this budget process. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the Public Work Administration facility later this evening. The debt financing implications are based on the planned size of the 973 square meter facility. So it was the largest build out size that was proposed in the background that was considered last fall. It is proposed that this debt would be serviced entirely through taxation. And then lastly, we have the RCMP detachment facility upgrade. And so, as you know, the planned spend on this initiative for 2023 is associated with our proportionate share of the validation exercise and that report that will be coming back sometime this year. The anticipated spend in the financial plan for 2024 and 25 is our proportionate share of the estimated cost that was previously provided with the work that has been done between the member municipalities and Colliers. And so this, unlike the last two initiatives, the costs associated with this facility for this city will see us that when we have this project complete, we are proposing that we would be financing it entirely through debt financing, and the annual servicing would be about $1.1 million. You heard me refer earlier to sustainable revenues to support the debt servicing. And so that's why you heard from us during service review to introduce and to start to phase in the implications of this debt servicing so that we don't go from having no revenues to needing, just over the $1.1 million, but that we incrementally tax the community for this initiative. And so this plan proposes the introduction of a reserve transfer of $325,000 in year one. And then in year two, we would increase that reserve transfer to $650,000. And then in year three, we would increase it to $975,000. I mean, that's an estimated phase in based on estimated debt servicing costs. As you know, a decision has not been made on ultimately whether or not to proceed with a detachment that would drive these costs. But it is important to recognize the financial implications as this is a 5-year plan. That's a fair bit that I've covered, but I did want to take some time to talk about the debt servicing implications. This city has not incurred new debt in really well over a decade. We had some maybe 7 or 8 years ago, but it was for sewer infrastructure works that were somewhat already underway. So in terms of new debt considerations, it has been some time. Our liability servicing limit is low. We're at 14% of what is allowable. The needs are articulated, within this financial plan. And so when we consider the impact of both the existing and the new debt, this chart before you and within this financial plan summarizes. And so I did want to highlight, this is quite a lengthy process to secure long-term debt financing. We have our marching orders in place for the sidewalk and bike lane related works. We will be returning to council with loan authorization bylaws. But ultimately, short-term borrowing is limited on a per capita basis. And so when we look at, our estimated population and a $50 per capita, we've got access to about $1 million. Beyond that, legislation requires that we consult with the community and we ensure that there is the support for the spend. So there's two methods to seek the approval of the electors. You'll typically see the alternative approval process followed. So if 10% or more of our eligible electors are against it, then we would not proceed. Otherwise, we would proceed. And then we would follow ultimately a multi-bylaw process that the last time I did it took upwards of about 6 months. So when we talk about doing this process this year, we're looking at the spring 2024 long-term debt issuance. So debt isn't issued directly to Colwood, it's issued to the Capital Regional District. So we are anticipating that at the earliest, it would be the spring 2024 issue, possibly the fall 2024 issue. So I know that's a fair bit of information. I'll pause for any questions with respect to debt servicing and management.
Would we always do the AAP before we even consider referendum then? Is that the normal practice?
I'll preface this by saying I don't know that there is much of a normal. In my experience at Colwood, it has been years since we have consulted the community on a long-term debt issue. The last debt issue was based on loan authorization bylaws that were put in place well before my time here. I think some of them dated back to the 1990s. And so it has been some time that we have had this process at the city. My understanding, the alternate approval process is almost like testing the waters with your community, because if that were to fail, you can then go to a referendum. I don't have the experience here to comment on.
Way, though, obviously.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Cynthia, Councillor Dave, let's start. There we go.
I'm just wondering, could you go back to the last slide? And I was trying to understand your comments about our limits for debt servicing. And this chart clearly shows that by 2027, which is really not that long from now, we're looking at potentially being up to 38%, with a bit of a blip the year before at 43%. Is that not above our capacity?
To clarify, are you trying to the 25% is our marker of what we can at most service is about $6.5 million.
Right, but your chart is showing us at 14% in 23, at 17% 24, at 30% in 25, and 43% in 26. So is not 43% greater than our capacity to borrow?
No, the capacity is approximately $6.5 million.
Oh, I see. So you're saying of our, okay,
yes,
I got you now. Yeah, you just lost me there and there was too many words and I was stuck on the last sentence.
Yes, so we're well within our legislated capacity, and what we need to consider and the implications is how we're servicing this debt, which when we look at this financial plan, we are proposing taxation to service the debt associated with the Public Works Administration facility and with the RCMP detachment facility. The sidewalk and bike lane program, there are a couple road DCC projects there. And so those projects, to the extent the DCCs are funding them, the DCC revenue will service the debt.
So I guess the best thing for me to do at this point in time is to put a pin on this slide to come back to and look at it again after we've had some discussions about our sewer master plan, because I was very involved at the CRD and in Colwood through the development of our sewage treatment plant. And I know what some of our limitations are there. So I'm very concerned that thus far in our plan, we have not been able to really wrap up or put a bow on what we'll need to do in order to service the community that we are envisioning. And because of that, the numbers that we're looking at, even though we're not, right bumping up against the top of our debt ceiling, I have been in Colwood for bumping up against that debt ceiling, and it wasn't a very comfortable position to be in. And we certainly have a lot more control right now. So I'm just very concerned, and I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't say that that's a caveat for me in looking at our 5-year financial plan. Have we considered everything? Do we have a plan for how to make it all work?
Okay, and so with that, next up is a review of the 5-year capital plan. So in sum, we have an $82 million capital plan, proposed spend over the next 5 years. The majority of that spend is in the area of our roads infrastructure and our facility infrastructure. So we'll go through each of these operating budgets with the focus on where the majority of the spend is, but we are available to answer questions on any of these initiatives. So we'll be starting at page 116 of the financial plan and into the road infrastructure program. We have a number of recurring programs within our road infrastructure capital plan. So the annual paving program was introduced a few years ago. This is where we set aside equal financing annually, $600,000 funded through our sustainable infrastructure. And our team continues to work on paving improvements and paving work throughout the city, prioritized based on our 2018 pavement condition index. We also have an LED upgrade program for existing streetlights. That program is underway and sees spend annually. Similarly, our traffic signal program, so we look at controller upgrades. And again, these programs have been introduced in recent years. We had some impacts due to COVID that deferred works, but the team continues to work away under these programs. We maintain annual budgets for the Esquimalt Lagoon Bridge, whether it's localized repair work or the need for updated inspections. And so the last inspection was completed in 2018, and so we are due for re-inspection this year, and that will drive further spend in the area of that infrastructure. In addition, signage and wayfinding infrastructure, we refer to this as a recurring program. Last year, we were successful in receiving federal grant funding. So this spend in particular into 2023 is associated with the works that were identified under that grant. And so new signage will be in place, I believe imminently. We're looking to have that work wrapped up next month. But this is work that was previously approved under last year's financial plan. The sidewalk and bike lane program, there's extensive background on, page 119 and 120 of the financial plan. And so this program was introduced a couple of years ago, and specific projects were endorsed by previous council, and the works on those projects are underway. So in 2020 and 21, we did some sidewalk projects along a specific area of Machosen Road and Painter Road. Moving into this financial plan, we have tendered works of the Owens and Benhomer sidewalk improvement projects. Those works are funded through gas tax. Next up, we have a series of 5 projects split over the next 2 years. The sum of the anticipated spend on those 5 projects was what I was just referring to during the debt management section. So we will be returning to council with loan authorization bylaws to finance the Kelly Road sidewalk, the Hagel Road sidewalk, bikeway, and then next year, Lagoon Road sidewalk and Fulton Road sidewalk. So the city has engaged additional engineering services to support the design of these projects. That work is underway and will continue into this year. In addition, we do have some funding set aside annually to support the transition to protected bike lanes, which will be prioritized based on feedback coming out of the active transportation work and committee feedback there. And so in sum, that's what is currently proposed in this financial plan in the area of the sidewalk and bike lane program. Specific projects for the years 2025 and beyond have not yet been proposed and will be for consideration through the active transportation plan. I'll pause there for Councillor Day.
Councillor Day.
Thank you. I'm just worrying a little bit about the sidewalk program in those areas that may develop in future. I can't remember if Kelly Road is in our DCCs or not, but if we've already built the sidewalks and then development occurs in that corridor, we may be not able to gain any development contributions towards them. That was the situation on Whale Road.
So both Kelly Road and Lagoon are both DCC projects.
Okay. So as DCC projects, they will be funded through development, whether they're built before development occurs or after. Okay. Thank you.
A portion, yes. Yeah, there is an existing benefit factor for both of those projects, and the existing benefit factor will be funded through taxation, road DCCs for the remaining balance, correct?
Councillor Torgerson.
I'm just trying to figure out, or I'm wondering when the change happened for the Lagoon Road sidewalk to be funded in 2024, when it was explained to me that it was going to be in 2023.
And I will defer to my colleagues in engineering for specificity. When we brought forward, we had multiple conversations last year with respect to the sidewalk and bike lane program. 2 meetings stand out, June 22 and July of 22. And at the July of 22 meeting, I believe it was both that conversation as well as the staff report that identified the split in terms of how the works were being prioritized in the immediate. In part, the fact that these works are subject to the debt financing, we do need to go through those approval processes, which is why the Owens and Benhomer are happening first. And so they were tendered late 22, construction into 2023, and then moving forward with the Kelly and Hagel. Beyond that, I would have to defer.
Come to the mic, please.
Seems like a fairly long walk for a really short answer. Jen's correct. We couldn't do the work or start the funding on the projects until we get confirmation that debt servicing is available. So the projects had to be pushed to 2024 until that's confirmed.
Seeing no other questions, please proceed, Jen.
Okay, so moving out of our recurring program spend, now I'll have a quick review over the previously approved road infrastructure projects. So the intersection improvements, Latoria at Veterans Memorial Parkway, that work is well underway. As you know, the project budget was revised in 2022. We have incurred a little under half of the cost to date. The remaining project budget of $4.3 million is believed at this time to be sufficient to support the completion of this work, which will take us into 2023 for completion. We'll pause if there's any questions on these works. Otherwise, I'll move to the next budget.
Seeing none, please proceed.
Allendale Road Works and Services. So these works were initiated in 2021, received substantial completion in 2022. And we are seeking an additional funding to complete the works early this year. And so we did want to highlight, the approved project budget for these works and services was just over $6.2 million. We project that we're going to spend a little over $6.4 million, coming in about 3.5% over the budget on these works. Like I said, substantial completion was received in 2022, and we'll be finalizing these works early this year. Galloping Goose Overpass Bridge. So this is one area. As you know, we were successful in a federal grant application. That federal grant will be funding the majority of the spend in this area. In terms of the status of the work to date, we have 4 pre-qualified proponents that are engaged, and we will be receiving their submissions with preliminary design for council's consideration, I believe in the second quarter of this year.
End of March.
End of March. And so that will be back in chambers for consideration. The only other thing I would want to highlight at this point is really until council sees the design work, that budget estimate absolutely is just that. And so when we get back into chambers, we can have a more fulsome discussion about these works.
Just a quick question, Jen, on this. Who's actually managing this project? Is it subcontract or is it us?
Thank you for the question. So I'm the capital projects lead and I'm managing it on behalf of the city. However, we have subcontracted the project management to Colliers, who's bringing us through the procurement phase. At the end of the procurement phase, once the council has selected the proponent, we're in discussions on how we'd like to proceed with them or another acting as a contract administrator.
So I'm sorry, I'm going down into the weeds, but it's just for my own edification right now, because we end up defending, projects that are overrun all the time. So we subcontract this, and when we subcontract, I guess there's no such thing as a firm fixed price project, is there? Because it just seems like it's every project that happens, in municipal government or provincial government for that matters. But there's no consequences. Like we overrun and everybody goes, They shrug their shoulders, and is there something that we can do to better manage that ourselves? It's just an open-ended question.
Well, I can try to address, one of the problems is, I won't speak to the Colliers project, Colliers contract. They're just a contract administrator that are bringing us through the process. However, our attempt to try to control costs, because this is grant funded, is to go through a design build contract with whoever the successful proponent will be. The intent of that is to try to hold them to and work together with them through the design to come up with a design that will stay under budget. And if that design build team is both a designer and builder, we can work collaboratively with them to stay within that $5 million budget.
Okay, so do we, I'm sorry again, this is I'm down in the trees, but it's just that we always get the questions right on this, and not necessarily the staff, but so obviously project overruns are our problem, right? Because we have to pick up the tab. So I guess where I'm going with this is that who actually controls, like, the biggest costs I know in these engineering projects like this are engineering change orders. I don't know if you call them the same thing, but they're the things that always make everything overrun. So in these type of projects where you subcontract, does the city have a say in which engineering change orders are authorized and which aren't? Like, I don't know. And the only reason I want to find out how much influence or control we have on a project.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, we have ultimate control on all those decisions. Every single change order, we act in a lot of this role as the owner of the infrastructure. So it would be just like a normal, say, developer who develops a project, hires an engineer, hires an architect. Ultimately, when things change or there's a change required, it comes back to the owner for consideration. We do the same things. When a change order comes in, our consultant would review it, decide whether it's justified or not. At that point, they would come to us and ask us if we wanted to continue with it. We'd have the conversation about the ramifications of not proceeding and not going with the change order. And to speak to your question about, why is there an overrun? What happens? Part of the hard part of these projects is we're digging in ground sometimes that has never been dug before. So we go in and we think, okay, well, the land when we built the sidewalk 20 years ago was gravel. So we think the gravel where we're going to build the sidewalk on the other side of the street is gravel. When we get there, we find out that side is rock. So we didn't put any money in to go, okay, we're going to have to blast out everything to build a sidewalk. We're going to have to blast out to put in the storm sewer infrastructure. So consequently, they come back and go, well, nobody knew about this rock. We'd like an extra, because now we can't dig it with an excavator. We've got to blast it with a blasting permit. So that's the kind of conversation where we have them go, okay, should we do this? Well, we don't have a choice. Of course we would do that. So a lot of this infrastructure, when it comes to us, we try to anticipate the best we can, and hopefully our contingency of 20% or 25% or 15% is enough to cover those costs off. But in some cases, it's something that's so inherently large that we can't do that. So in a lot of cases, that's the reason. Sometimes we encounter, again, with cities, we are fortunate here in Colwood, so I can't speak to this too much, but we're fairly new. Most of our infrastructure is 50 years or less. So I wouldn't anticipate records would be poor, but if you get into Victoria or Oak Bay, where their records are 100 years old, a lot of times a pipe that was moved or replaced or buried deeper, you're not aware of it. So you go on an assumption that whatever your current data is the data you designed by, and then you find out, oh, that pipe's not there anymore. It's somewhere else. I mean, usually it's because the guy that put it in retired and nobody kept records of it. So we didn't actually track it. So through our asset management program, hopefully we start getting better at this stuff, because we're tracking these things more and more, monitoring them more, and we're keeping an eye on it. So I hope that helps with that ancillary question. I can certainly answer anything else for you.
That's perfect. Thank you very much. For some reason, you're not showing up. Wonder, stop it and then re-push it. I can't get Councillor Day on right now. Yeah, I see it, but I still. list. Can we take 5? We'll take a washroom break here. We'll figure out the technical difficulties here. I don't know.
Is this on power?
Yep. No, that won't.
all kind of on the same page with how we're doing and what we're doing. So I guess I was thinking about how to phrase this, because it really doesn't matter what project I pick. They all come back to having the same difficulty, which is us being able to speak with integrity about projects that the city is doing. So when we're talking about all of these big, important and wonderful projects, it's crossing my mind that, oh gosh, we're doing that Galloping Goose overpass, for example, this year. And what other things would be, how could we make it better by clustering, our projects, and there isn't really a place. You all know how packed the agendas are, and it's tough for you and it's tough for us. And so I'm just trying to advocate for us having, a few maybe workshops or smaller engagements where we can just talk about those issues, so that not so that we can micromanage you, but so that we understand the projects and how we're planning to roll them out, and can throw up those balloons. Well, what if council, approved some little pedestrian projects that's adjacent to something else that you're working on? Would that make sense? Or just to try to, we all have, there's wonderful brains around this table. There's wonderful brains in staff, but we don't get to cross-pollinate each other all that often in a workshop setting. So I think it might be helpful to everybody to be on the same page and getting the best support for the community.
Thank you very much, Councillor Day. Well, whoops. Oh, John, go ahead.
Thank you, Worship, through to Councillor Day. It wasn't really a question, but it made me think that one of the projects, when we were talking about service plans, we talked about top 3 priorities. And if you've had a chance to look at the service plan, one of the top 3 priorities for engineering this year was to develop 5, 30, and 100-year programs. I think that 5-year, 5, 30, 100-year program is a real opportunity for us to do like workshop type things, because we'll come back, we plan to come back with a storm master plan, a sanitary sewer master plan. We're going to have a conversation about rock walls, geotechnical rock walls, and layering on a plan for taking care of those. So I think all of those type things, a road master plan, we can come back. And one of the things we try to do while we're layering on that engagement is to go, okay, when are we going to build a road? And when is this storm pipe going to be built? And if they're getting close to the same age, let's do them at the same time, either pull one of them forward or push one of them out, so that we do that work at the same time. Those conversations will also allow us to layer on your own experience within the town with regards to one of the things we do. We've gone to Public Works and asked them their experience with regard to flooding, but that'll give us the conversation to have that flavor with yourselves as well. So I think those individual ones, when we bring those plans back, will give us that opportunity to have like a workshop experience. And if we think it needs more time than at a council meeting, when we bring it back, then we can, perhaps that would be a great time to say, let's push this out and actually have a meeting to discuss this actual plan. So I think there is an opportunity for us to address that concern, I hope.
Yeah, and I think that I guess implied in there was the question of, is having that kind of workshop, does that interrupt your work, or is it beneficial? Is that something we should talk about ourselves and then bring back to you our ideas? Like, I'm just trying to figure out how to make it efficient for everybody.
I definitely think it would be beneficial. I think having that conversation, we're going to have that conversation sooner or later. Way better to have it at the front of the conversation and the backside, because it allows us to layer on things that we're not aware of, that you're getting from the community that we may not know, because we're not getting engaged at Thrifties by the public, and having somebody come up to us and say, hey, I know you're so-and-so, and why are you doing this when my neighborhood has that? We never get those conversations other than if something actually happens. So I definitely think that extra layer of information coming from the conversations you had, I'm not necessarily saying we're going to say yes to it, but what we will do is investigate it and see what merit it has. And if nothing else, we can give you the answer on why we're not going to, so that you can go back and talk to that person and say, I've looked into it and this is what it is, or we had this meeting and this is why they've discussed that. And it allows you to at least say, I'm listening, which I think is a benefit for both of us.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much. And for some reason, I've got this face that that everyone recognizes. I don't know why. It's the bow tie. Okay, Val, please proceed. Oops, Councillor Ward, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to reiterate, I think it was January 23rd council meeting. I did request a formal workshop to create or share expectations from council for staff. That was in response to, I believe, Yasmin's commentary that, and I think the same is true for many staff. They have to come before council and each time, positive or negative, kind of take that away and build an understanding of what council's direction might be. And frankly, I felt that to be a waste of staff time. And I felt there was a better way to do that. So that should be in the minutes. That was something that has been proposed.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so moving on, the next previously approved project, the intersection improvements, chosen at Latoria. So these works are well underway. These are works that are being administered by the developer and that the city is working in conjunction with the developer on these works. And they are progressing into 2023 and we anticipate that they will finalize this year. So now moving on to new budget considerations within the area of road infrastructure, starting with the active transportation counter implementation. So this is another area where we were successful in a grant application that will provide partial funding to install 7 eco counter installations. And we are also looking, I believe, was it? Yes, seven installations, 2 larger and then 5 more discrete counters. We're looking to get this work done in this year, and this will help provide and support some of the decision making in this area moving into the future. So we have proposed a multi-year bus stop infrastructure improvement program. We have made an application through BC Transit, which provides some provincial and federal funding to help subsidize the costs of the infrastructure improvements. So the budget before you reflects the subsidized cost, and we have prioritized works. And so the 2 bus stops that have the highest onboarding numbers are located VMP at Cairndale and Ben Homer at Painter. And so those are the locations that are being proposed initially under this plan. So then moving into DCC projects that are being integrated into this draft financial plan, starting with the Whale and Wilford Road intersection. So previously, when the road DCC project list was before council about a year ago for prioritization, these works were not lifted up within the next 5 years. Given current development projects that are happening in this area, administration, we have elevated this project for consideration for the 2023 year. Moving into 2024, intersection improvements. So cost estimates have been revised. So we have looked at both the unit cost estimates as well as increasing the contingency factor with these DCC projects. And the next one up is the intersection Veterans Memorial at Cairndale, and that has been proposed for 2024. Lastly, we have 3 projects that are identified for each of 2025, 26, and 27. But there are a number of factors that may impact the timing of these works. The Royal Bay frontage works. The city has received a request for a DCC credit. So similar to other works that are occurring in the Royal Bay area right now, these works would not see the city spending existing DCC dollars, but granting a credit that would be applied against future DCCs owing to the city. Administration staff will be returning to council with further information to seek specific guidance and direction on next year's financial plan with respect to these works here. And so with that, that's the overview of the road infrastructure budget. I'll pause for any questions before we move on to facility infrastructure.
Yes, John.
Thank you, Your Worship. I hope Mr. Earl's okay with this, but generally when you're not asking questions, I just sit back. But I just wanted to point out for council that one of the things that we are doing with regards to the DCC projects, Jen had mentioned that we've looked at inflation, we've looked at unit prices, and one of the additional items we're going to do is look at the scope and see, because we've had so many changes with our infrastructure and our traffic and our development since it was originally developed, that we want to look at and see if the original DCC program is still valid moving into the future. And I think one of those areas where we want to make sure we're truthing out is roundabouts. And with the success of VMP, we really felt that there's a couple of areas where, I mean, there's a lot of design parameters around roundabouts. And I know that everybody just says, oh, they work the best. And under the right situation, they do work the best, but there are places where they don't. So for instance, the Welford Whale intersection, we are having a look at that intersection. It's unlikely that it's going to prove out just because there's so much cycling traffic and pedestrian traffic in that area because of the goose, that the traffic would overwhelm the pedestrians and the cyclists and not allow them to work through that corridor quick enough. So it's my expectation that that wouldn't prove out as a good place to look. But when I look at an intersection like Souk and Machosen, that was looked at for a intersection upgrade with regards to traffic lights, I really think because of the off-ramp going on to Machosen and the on-ramp from Machosen onto Souk, and the fact that it's a three-prong intersection and there's a lot of land there, and that the traffic is not quite balanced but close with regards to Souk today and Machosen tomorrow, that might make a really good place to really discuss and look hard at a roundabout. So the impact of that is you're going to pay upfront a capital cost of a lot more money for that roundabout, but long-term and for traffic movement wise and safety, you're going to gain some benefits. So that's the kind of conversation that if you look in the program, we're doing 20,000 on DCC works this year for roads. That's one of the things that we're going to ground truth out and come back to council with regards to some of these scope changes that could impact the ultimate cost of the DCCs in the program and change that. But obviously we come back to council for that discussion. So I just thought I would add that piece in just to let you know that we are looking at scope change as well moving into the future.
Thank you very much. It's very informative, John.
And so moving into our facility infrastructure, we've got a 5-year capital plan on page 126. It's approximately $31 million over the 5 years. The majority of that spend is related to the RCMP detachment upgrade and the Public Works Administration facility. So when we look at the previously approved infrastructure, we have $70,000 budgeted for the St. John's Church facility improvements. Our financial plan maintains a $30,000 contingency budget in this area should anything arise. We have a plan underway that will see replacement of the septic field for this facility, and this budget includes $40,000 to support that work. Moving into previously approved budgets related to the City Hall facility. So in recent years, 2021, 2022, we started work on space optimization of City Hall here. We did construction in 2022 primarily. We are proposing an additional, so we did come in under budget last year, but about $10,000. We're now proposing a $50,000 budget to continue some of this work. So looking at a couple of additional office spaces, as well as work to convert a storage room into a printer room and a meeting facility, and just kind of continue to enhance the space for a growing workforce. We've had a budget in place for the major repair and replacement of the roof at the facility. So this year we're looking to create a life cycle refurbishment plan. We'll do that full building review and we'll then move into likely next year to a roof replacement. So that work has been deferred because it is important that we do that review to support the needed roof replacement that we anticipate. Previously approved.
Just going to interrupt you very quickly. That City Hall facility, if I understand this correctly, Mr. Earl, this was done by us, correct?
Sorry, the interior retrofit?
Yes.
Yeah, that was managed by our in-house building team.
So phenomenal. Actually delivered something under budget. So I just want to, I don't know if the rest of council knows that, but I just wanted to pass on my kudos to the team. That was pretty phenomenal. Thank you very much.
So we have funding set aside this year for the replacement of a door on the Bryan room over at the Public Works Yard. And then similarly for the fire hall roof repair, we'll be doing that life cycle refurbishment plan this year and looking to move into the replacement major refurbishment work next year. So the RCMP detachment upgrades, most recently heard kind of a summation of the work that has happened over the last couple of years in this area. We have council's direction to move forward with the development of a validation report. And so ultimately that report will facilitate a conversation in chambers later this year to determine whether or not we will proceed with this project. So the 2023 budget reflects our proportionate share of that stage of work that is happening. And then the 2024 and 25 budget is estimated based on previous information that has been presented. And so pending direction out of the validation report, we will then return with refined budget estimates. Councillor Day.
Councillor Day.
Thank you. So some of these items, this is the first time that I'm really being aware of them and some of the history that goes with them. And I think that may be because of past committee or council procedures. But I think that it would be really beneficial to know when will we be able to discuss these items in more specific terms. Rather, this is a budget meeting. I'm trying to stay high level on the budget issues, but I just thought I would ask the question of when we would have an opportunity to actually talk about some of these and perhaps be able to gain some council input into moving some things up or some things back or other discussions of that nature.
Thank you, Councillor Day. Short answer is now is good. You know, we've got the whole team here. The expectation is if there's a project that you'd like to gather more insight on, we'd love to answer questions. We'd love to get your direction about accelerating or decelerating the project. Some of these projects are underway and won't come back to chambers, and we'll just continue going. Others have natural triggers that cause us either to affirm scope or to approve funding to come back, but that's not the case in every instance. And so I'd encourage, if you have questions at this time, we've got the team here and we'd like to talk about it.
Sure. So for 170 Goldfinch, this is our building that was leased to the Two Water site. And we've had several occasions to hear requests from community groups that would like to be able to use these facilities to run programming. And this doesn't, it doesn't appear as if that has been considered in this report.
Thank you, Councillor Day. We're not quite there yet. And so as you've described, that facility was leased out. It's now returned to the municipality, and the current landowner has signaled a disinterest in continuing that lease. Our building team has reviewed the facility, found some minor improvements and refurbishments needed to some of the roof area, but the building is in very good condition and is a quality build. We have discovered that it has one toilet facility, which would land in an occupancy of 10 people. And so it's administration's expectation, given the draft waterfront stewardship plan and council's previous direction, that this facility, once it returned to us, come into public hands and be used for public purposes, that maximizing the public occupancy through a washroom upgrade is a likely step needed. We have notionally put in a budget to support that, but we will return to council in the next 90 days seeking high-level direction to continue what the draft watershed stewardship plan suggests, which is the repurposing of this facility for public uses. And then we will seek council's direction on how you'd like us to communicate broadly to the community how this facility will be, what it will look like once we've done the washroom upgrade, the various uses, and then seek public input and return to council on how you'd like to distribute that asset.
That's wonderful. From my perspective, it's a little bit backwards. You're planning the upgrades and then looking at the purpose. So I'd like to talk about our purpose and then plan our upgrades accordingly, but that's just me. And I certainly am looking forward to that. I was noticing for myself, for the City Hall building, when I come here and it's dark in the wintertime, really miss the pergola roof and the lighting that's very, very dim at the front of our building. So those are a couple of things that I just wanted to bring to your attention. We do have, so many things that go on here, but from my perspective, coming here for meetings, I just find it a little unfriendly at the front of the building, let me put it that way. Every facility that we have, that we offer to the public, is used for good purposes. I'm very proud of our history with St. John's Church and Emery Hall, and I hope that we can keep that mindset as we go forward to find ways to support our community. Thank you.
Councillor Jensen.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. Based on what you just said, Mr. Earl, and you can clarify perhaps a little bit further, but I look at all this and I keep seeing bits and pieces about well, a lot of information seems to be coming at us about the police building and the funding for the police building, and which is going to dominate obviously the next few years. And then right on the heels of that, or in concert at the same time of that, is the public works building. And I'm sure if we saw seeing a piece of fire apparatus in there in the midst of all that, somewhere in there, I'm quite sure will probably crop up as well. And I think that's a lot to digest for a community of our size. I just wonder if, do we need to make a choice, one or the other, or is there room for both as we move forward funding wise? I'd hate to see us sort of go for two big buildings, back to back on the heels of each other. I'd love your comments. I'm not sure if this is the time or not. I wasn't going to say anything until you brought it up, sir.
Jen, I know you have the answer.
Through the chair. I mean, the direct answer is this financial plan that's before you is seeking to balance multiple priorities, competing priorities. This financial plan is proposing a spend on both the detachment facility, the Public Works Administration building, and yes, there is some fleet as well. We spent a fair bit of time tonight talking about and understanding the proposed tax increase for year one. By the end of the week, we will have walked through what that proposed tax increase looks like for year 2, 3, 4, and 5. It is the expectation, and it is my belief as your CFO that there is room to support both of these specific facility initiatives that you mentioned. It's an understanding of how we're financing them. This plan does propose that we do both. And I mentioned at the onset of this evening, there is a lot of content. I mean, not just in, you've got a 150-page document before you, but some of these initiatives we have been talking about for multiple years. The RCMP detachment upgrades, we started conversation a few years back. More recently, last month, we had 2 separate council agendas with reports, with presentations. There is a lot of information to digest. These are complicated projects. They have complicated budgets. They have multi-year budgets. The funding sources are varying depending. So we do not expect necessarily direction in a single budget meeting tonight. But that being said, that direction is how we move forward on this plan. The majority of the contents in this plan is based on previous direction, the 2019 to 23 strategic plan, previous service reviews, previous financial plans, and most recently this service review. That being said, this is an opportunity. You have before you virtually all of the financial implications of what we have planned for the next 5 years. And so this is an opportunity to comment on that, to reprioritize, to move initiatives forward, to push them out.
I guess the part I have a problem with is we're already going to be taxing our community in lieu of a police building that's still at the conceptual stage. And so how do we package that up and feed it to the public in a manner that they understand? I'm comfortable explaining it, but there's a lot there. And, let's circle back to the Public Works building. But my recollection of the Public Works building is we sent it back and we're waiting for it to come back again. So we haven't made decisions on it. And yet we are proposing spending and taxing and funding. And so I haven't had any say on what that design looks like or anything like that. I mean, I get that we're trying to be forward looking, but it's difficult to process. That's more of a statement. Sorry, Jen, I don't know.
No, thank you. And I do hear a question there. I mean, to be specific, we have not received direction on whether or not to proceed with the Public Works Administration building. We have received direction on what information we're going to use to support the next steps. May of 2022, there was a presentation about a feasibility study. It was used as reference for the master planning exercise of that facility. We've had 2 subsequent public council meetings since that time, most recently September of 2022 on the Public Works Administration building. That was when we brought forward updated Class D cost estimates for each of the 3 options that were lifted up out of that feasibility study. And you're correct, council directed that we resolve. I mean, specifically, the conversation in the fall was it's difficult to consider the debt financing implications in isolation. You knew that you have other considerations, the RCMP detachment facility. And so it was, we were directed to return. This financial plan is the first time you're seeing the culmination of the impact of the 3 proposed new debt initiatives. That was the debt management conversation earlier tonight. But you're absolutely correct. We have not received direction yet on where we are going with that public works facility. And so similarly on that topic, my expectation is we will be back in chambers with those cost estimates now that council has had chance to see the impact of the debt servicing requirements for all that is proposed in the next 5 years. I believe you have better background to return to that conversation from last
It's a
fall.
cart and horse scenario though, because if if the Public Works building comes back in May and we decide to shut it down for another few years, we've already asked the taxpayer for how much money, so I see this as funded from surplus long-term debt, but you get my point that it might not be specific to that building or that particular line item, but we're going to tax in advance of us having the deep discussion about whether we're even going to move forward.
No, we are not. So this year we are proposing a tax increase associated with the RCMP detachment facility. This year, we are not proposing any tax increase associated with the Public Works Admin building, but we are for future years.
I see the funding source, but I think it's a philosophical point I'm trying to take because we're trying to process this and digest it over the next 5 years, potentially asking for money from the taxpayer in advance of us even taking a decision on whether this is going to go ahead or not.
That is commonplace in the preparation of a multi-year financial plan.
I have an arts degree, sorry, Ben.
Mr. Earl, you
Thank
want
you.
to say, add something?
I don't know if I'm going to add, but so in September, council didn't feel prepared to provide a final decision on the Public Works building. 3 options were presented. Council at the time, it felt like very much wanted to put that decision into the context of other borrowing. This is the context of other borrowing. And so for the purposes of the financial plan, we put in kind of the most expensive component such that should you choose that later on, when we bring that decision back, the financial plan has considered it. Ultimately, the taxation associated with that will not occur in 23, but would occur in future years. And ultimately, because this is a borrowing, we need to go to the public. And if the public should not be interested in funding that facility, then the borrowing would not occur and the taxation would not occur as well. If I could answer your first question though, Your Worship.
Yes, please.
So if we're going to have a police service and that police service needs a facility, and if we're going to have a public works building and that public works service needs a facility, and those are 2 questions that are arguably answered in different ways. It's been my experience that because of the power of municipal borrowing, MFA is a great example of 2.2% per year. It is rare that construction cost inflation is a number below that. And so the borrowing to build today has historically outperformed saving to build tomorrow.
Thank you. It's actually, I was probably the one that asked for the context of the debt. So I'm happy with it now. And now it's just a matter of trying to figure out, what level of debt, everyone here is comfortable with. That's a different question altogether. And but one thing that I want to put a caveat in one thing though. The RCMP building, until Langford passes that, it's not a project right now. There's only 2 municipalities of the three owners, which are View Royal, Colwood, and Langford. Langford is the largest owner of it. They own over 50% of it. They still haven't passed this yet. So there is a caveat I want to put on that right now. And I don't know. Someone say bet on it. I couldn't tell you now. I just don't know. It's different opinions depend on who you talk to. So I just want to put that one caveat in. Please proceed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Worship. So the Public Works facility, next we'll see us return to chambers, similar conversation that was before you last fall with the additional context that's been provided in this draft financial plan. We spoke briefly about what's being proposed, so now we're moving into new budgets. 170 Goldfinch, as you've heard, the previous use of this facility has ceased. And it is our belief that washroom upgrades will likely be recommended. And so you just heard from our CAO, we will be back before chambers to have a more fulsome conversation about these works in the near term. And so that concludes the overview of the facility budget, and we'll now move into the city's drainage infrastructure budget. General drainage program is outlined starting on page 129 of our financial plan. And I will look to engineering colleagues to articulate on the spend both this year and next with respect to the Fulton Road storm pipe repair and upgrade, or look to council if you have any questions in this area.
Councillor Day.
Thank you. I just want to speak to, especially with regard to the drainage. Drainage is something that has caught up with Colwood a number of times, and generally related to issues that perhaps were known in the community, but that information didn't get transferred to staff at the city. It can, at any point in time, jump up like Paranda Lane did. In this case, that particular area was pointed out to me, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago by people living in the area who said, gosh, don't you think that looks dangerous? And I am unable to answer, I can only say that I'm sure city staff drive around here too and see what we're seeing. So they must be aware. But of course, as we go, we refine our knowledge of everything. And there's a lot of areas in Colwood that potentially could be serious issues for the city going forward. They just haven't come to the forefront yet. And I'm just trying to wrap my head around how do we be proactive and investigate those areas or identify them with staff. Is there a preferred method? Do we need to do more, sort of meeting with our public to say, if you were gonna put money on a catastrophe, where would you put your money, right? Some dots on a map for investigation would be a good start, just to do some proactive, checking. How are things going?
Thank you, Worship, through the Councillor Day. It's funny you say map, because earlier tonight when you talked about engagement and we had the conversation about the 5, 30, and 100-year plan, in my mind, okay, I'm sitting here, Jen, your presentation is interesting, but at times my mind wanders. And I was thinking about drainage, and I thought, I think I'm going to use that map we used at the idea fair and spread it out and say to council, here's your stickies. Show us all the places where people have said to you there's a concern, put it down on the map, and then we'll go away and talk to public works crews and say, hey, You know, one, have you experienced it historically in these areas? And two, moving forward in the future, let's put these on our troubleshooting list and make a trip while these rainfalls are happening. So when we get some of these higher intensity rainfalls, we can go and actually investigate those while they're occurring. I hesitate to just say, well, ask whoever tells us and we'll listen, because again, sometimes it can be, you know, a catch basin down the street could have been plugged and then somewhere else it caused a flood and they go, oh, this is the worst ever. This one time in 1982. It's like, well, that was the time the catch basin got plugged and that happened. So it's reasonable to look at it, but we want to do some ground truthing to it. But I do think that map idea, and that's one of those ones where when we present that plan and we say, let's put a little more time and effort into it, we bring out the map and we say, okay, go back, talk to you, whoever you end up talking to over the next month or so, we'll come back in time and let's put that plan out. That's one way of doing it. The other way is just be proactive and reach out to staff and say, hey, I had this concern about this area. We can put it on the list. I'd much rather hear it coming from you, knowing that you've probably vetted it with a bit of a conversation before you just said, yes, I'll check it. And then we can also follow up that way as they occur. I certainly think that's appropriate as well.
That's great feedback from your side. I think we need something a little more, I don't know, a plan or a list or something to check back on, because I've been here for a long time. I've been doing this job for a long time, and I've brought up a lot of problems a lot of times, and a lot of times they just go away because people are at capacity, and I get that. You know, I'm not trying to be hard on anybody. We all have weeks where one more thing won't fit on the list. So I'm not trying to be hard on anybody in any way. I'm just saying that if we have that list, we can refer to it. We can not lose it, not forget it, not lose the information that we got once, because it's a lot of work to do that communication piece. So I just put that as a kind of a caveat on that, because we got to keep talking. There's a lot of people in this community who've been here for a long time, who know a lot of great little details that we could lose if we don't try to capture it somehow.
Joshua, please.
Thanks, through the chair. I would just add, I think it's an interim fix maybe, but the calls for service that we have up on our website right now is another way that people can disseminate information to staff, and it does have a record. It doesn't get deleted, and then we do address it. I'm not saying that that's the long-term fix to what you're describing, but if there are now instances where people want to be heard and understood and have some accountability, say, hi, I called on this day, it was documented, it's in your system, we can go back and look. So that also is another avenue, at least in the temporary.
I have a quick question for you, Joshua. I think you're the best one to ask the question. You know, I don't want to sound like Henny Penny, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. But, you know, when I see the comment that a storm pipe has failed, we're not going to fix it. We're not going to fix it till next year. I scratch my head a little bit and I go, then why do we have storm drain pipes? So could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think Perenda, you're speaking about Perenda, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So that one in particular, we did have an assessment done right away to understand the severity and then also the consequence. So if something was to occur, if it was to get worse. The memo we received from the consultant at the time indicated that it does need to be fixed in the long term, but there's no immediate risk of continued failure. So it's number one on our list for addressing, but we do want to take comfort in the fact that the professional has evaluated it, given us that comfort to take the time to do it properly. So that's,
and it makes sense, the timing, what you want to do. So, but it just seemed kind of strange.
yeah.
Okay. No, I understand. Thank you very much for clarifying that.
I would just layer on to that the fact that one of the other considerations is consequence, not with regards to Perenda, but sometimes when we look at something and we've got to pick between a planned project and a failed pipe, sometimes we look at the failed pipe and go, okay, if the pipe fails and something happens, what gets flooded? And we look at it and go, okay, a little grassy area that will store some water for a day or two and then disappear and is not going to have a consequence. This other project, if it doesn't get completed that was planned, we could have, say, somebody's home flood. So sometimes we'll put an extra priority matrix onto that. That's not the case with Parenda. Joshua's correct. We actually had it assessed, but in other cases, sometimes we put that extra consequence and liability piece onto it. Say, property, death, injury, all of those things that go with it. So sometimes it's about that consequence for the planning.
Great. Thank you very much. That's a great explanation. See no other comments, please.
And
proceed.
so with that, if there's no further questions with respect to our drainage infrastructure budget, we'll move into the city's equipment expenditure budget. Both equipment and fleet, for the most part, are supported by the city's fleet and equipment replacement policy, as well as we have a number of recurring both equipment programs. This 5-year plan proposes a spend of about $2.8 million. There are 9 new equipment requests to consider, starting on page 134 of the financial plan. We do have our Public Works team here to answer any questions that you may have. I did not intend to go through each of the equipment and fleet budgets. It may take time that may not be as needed as some of the previous budgets.
Councillor Day.
So we have quite a big jump in 2025, followed by another jump in 26 for equipment replacement. And I'm just wondering what we're talking about there. 725,000 and then 150,000 basically.
Through the chair. Thank you, Councillor Day. Specifically in 2025, I believe we're looking at replacing our backhoes. Both backhoes will need replacement at that point. So at the moment, we're looking at sourcing out zero emission options and seeing where those are. But that's a placeholder budget for those kind of high priority, expensive pieces of equipment.
Okay, so why the follow-up in 26?
That is for additional pieces of equipment. I think it is for the Bobcat.
Sorry, bottom of page 132
Yeah.
provides the detail specific to those 2 budgets.
Okay, there we go. I missed that. Thank you.
Seeing no other questions, let's proceed.
So similarly, moving into the city's fleet budget, much of this spend is related to replacements that are in accordance with the city's fleet and equipment replacement policy. Starting on page 137, there is background detail on the specifics of what is being proposed for replacement. The majority of this was previously approved. We do integrate our replacement schedules with our annual 5-year plans. As well, there are, some new zero emission considerations as we continue to move forward with electrification of our fleet where possible. And I will pause should council have any questions with respect to our fleet budget.
Councillor Day.
Thank you. I haven't seen anything, and that doesn't mean that I didn't miss it, in regards to how we're going to be keeping our cycle lanes clean. So as we're looking at the buffered bike lanes coming up, I keep wondering how the heck we're going to keep the snow, ice, and debris out of the cycle lanes, and wondering if there is a plan. And if it's not known yet, that's an okay answer too.
Through the chair, and thank you, Councillor Day. In 2024, we do have a request for an additional sidewalk snow blower, which will be an invaluable piece of equipment for clearing those buffered areas.
Perfect. Can they do anything with debris, like construction debris?
With regards to sweeping, our sweeping contractor has a smaller machine that we currently use for some of those buffered areas, and we'll be able to add those on to that route as well.
Okay, great, thank you.
Seeing no other questions, let's proceed.
And so with that, I'd like to move along to page 139, an overview of our parks, trails, and recreation capital budget. So you'll see within the summary, we have multiple references to park improvements. In total, this budget is proposing a spend of a little over $3 million in the next 5 years related to the short-term infrastructure improvements as proposed in the individual parks management plans that have been approved in recent years. And so specifically, we are looking at the utilization of community amenities funding to fund these initiatives. And 2023 work will focus on Colwood Creek projects. And I will preface that the $1.2 million budget for Colwood Creek Park implementation, that is subject to a pending grant application. And so should that grant application not be successful, we do not currently have funding sources for the full extent of the $3 million referenced. But we will be moving on the park improvements that are identified within the respective management plans with the estimated cost of $783,000 in the next 2 years.
So just to clarify something, so if you don't get the federal grant, we would just do what we can afford, the 200,000, for example, and just do what we can get away with, and is that what happens?
Thank you for clarifying. So this plan has set aside about $1.8 million in community amenity funding to support park improvements, that top paragraph there that references. So focusing on Colwood Creek for 2023, and then 2024, we'll see Lookout Lake improvements. If we are not successful on the federal Natural Infrastructure Fund grant that we've applied to do additional restorative works within Colwood Creek, that would be something for us to return to council for additional funding considerations. But this plan on the restorative work for Colwood Creek is contingent on that grant application.
Thank you for clarifying.
Councillor Ward?
Councillor Ward?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We can't budget for what we don't have, obviously, but I would assume that if we were to expedite the parks DCC bylaw, that we would anticipate additional revenue in this year.
Correct, great assumption. At this point, I don't know that we would generate any revenue this year, but certainly next year.
Yeah, it's my understanding with a new DCC that projects that are in stream are exempt. And so administration are working hard to get a draft bylaw before June, get it into the ministry, and see if we can get an approved bylaw in place before halfway through the year, if we're lucky, such that we can turn on revenues for the latter half of this 5-year financial plan.
That's great, thank you. And I'm not one to engage in innuendo or anecdotal evidence, but in speaking with a couple of developers in the community, the impression I came away with was that they had money budgeted and felt that this was forthcoming under previous council in the final year and fully expected to pay. And we're talking 6 figures, a fairly high number. So to me, it's concerning, and I would suggest to council that if we can expedite this and help staff move it along quicker, then it's in the best interest of Colwood to do so. So thanks for the insight. Appreciate it.
Councillor Day?
My only caveat to that is that we need to know for sure who's in and who's out of the DCC, because if these are if the projects that have already been envisioned to council are exempt, there's very darned little that the DCC will be applying to.
Sorry, I may have misspoke. It is development projects that have already had their application in the door are exempt from applying a new DCC to. So a DP or more usually a building permit application. And so it would be administration's expectation that before the second quarter of 24 and after that point thereafter, 100% of development applications would have parks DCCs applied to them, both improvement and acquisition.
Yeah, my difficulty is I don't know, that's not obvious to me, what's in the door and what's not in the door. If it's zoned for it, maybe it applies, maybe it doesn't. And we don't know when it gets the DP because that's delegated to
Sorry.
staff.
Building permit application. So we can be clear when we bring the draft Parks DCC bylaw forward, kind of what building permit applications are in the door at this point. And that can perhaps give some clarity.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. Let's proceed.
Previously approved is a $30,000 budget to support a feasibility study for Royal Bay Recreation Center, and that is proposed for this year.
Could I just ask a quick question? I did pick up on that, but feasibility study. So it's the conceptual design, right? Is that what that feasibility study is? I wasn't too sure what the deliverable of that, it just seems funny. It's a feasibility. Well, of course they need one, so it's feasible. It just seemed like a strange wording on that one. I don't want to get all technical on it, but what is the deliverable of that anyway?
Thank you, Worship. Much like the project that we did at 330 Wishart that looked at what will our public works facility need 30 years from now. We estimated the various different components inside the building. And so what this work will do was it'll look at our rec master plan, some of the outputs of that. It will include conversations with stakeholder groups and the broad public about what type of use is most needed in an indoor facility in that part of Colwood and what is missing. And from that, we'll come up with a list of potential programming that would then guide what the building needs to look like. That would all come back to council, and then council would provide direction as to if you wanted us to advance into a detailed design that would form the foundation of a shovel-ready grant application.
I understand now. Thank you very much. Please proceed. Yes.
Thank you. And so with that, we're moving into our last asset class for the capital program overview, and that is our sewer utility infrastructure. Both of these budgets before you were previously approved. So the expansion Bexhill Place is underway and will wrap up this year. Last year's financial plan did introduce funding to support a lift station pump replacement program. That program has not yet been formalized, but will be, and this budget will support the replacement and the major maintenance works on the city's lift station. So with that, I will pause should council have any questions in this area.
Don't see any. Oh, Councilor Day.
Sure. I'm just wondering, these are all funded through the sewer utility, correct?
That is correct. So page 141 of your plan, but it's the sewer capital reserve that is funding both of these spends. And specifically with the recurring replacement program, in recent years, the city did increase the sewer utility rates, the user fee rates, so that we have sustainable funding set aside annually to support the pump station replacement program.
Thank you.
And so with that, we are through the content that we intended to cover tonight. Next scheduled will be Thursday evening. We will return and we will proceed through each of our service area plans. Most of that information will not be new, but it will be your opportunity to confirm expectations in each area, to endorse the financial implications of the service delivery previously directed. So Thursday's conversation really will be central to whether or not we want to see changes that are driving the financial implications and ultimately the taxation required to support those services. As well, you will hear from each of our teams with respect to special initiatives, both that are underway and that are newly proposed in this plan. And then we do have time scheduled Friday, February 24th, should we require it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Jen. Great job. Great job by staff. And I'm looking for a motion for adjournment then. Councillor Day, seconder, Councillor Jansen. All in favor? Yeah, unanimous. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.